In this second video of Unit 1 of Economy, we are going to talk about globalization. So globalization is a term that you probably have heard many times, but maybe you never managed to completely understand. So globalization describes the current situation in the world where the exchanges, the economic exchanges, but not only that, but also referring to culture and knowledge and population, all these exchanges and communications between countries have reached a maximum level. So this situation has no comparison to any previous situation in history, by far, and also the tendency of this intensification is unique. And many of the things that occur nowadays in the world are explained by this situation. So we can say that the process of globalization started in the 15th century when Europe started to explore and conquer territories in the rest of the continents. And this process of international integration that started very slowly, in just in a few aspects, has been intensifying, and even more since, we can say, World War II. Yes, so all countries and like cultures and economies in the world are strongly interconnected and therefore interdependent. So we have seen this very clearly recently this year in 2020, when as a consequence of COVID-19, the effects on one country had, like on the effects of the disease, the pandemic in some countries had consequences in other countries. And for example, the need of certain products that were produced in one country started to have a high demand in the rest of the world, and there was a huge problem because of that. Yeah. So it was a great example of the extreme interdependence of the economies nowadays. So all kinds of goods and services, people, ideas, and culture are exchanged between countries by all kinds of means. So let's try to understand what are the factors of causes that it explains how globalization is so intense nowadays. So one very obvious one is the improvement of transport that we will see more in depth in 2 units. So without the development of air transport as it exists nowadays, or without the development of land transport by trucks, trains, basically that, and also the maritime and fluvial transport, that actually maritime transport is the one who moves more, who transport more goods between continents, that would not exist. Yeah, so only when good highways were designed and dense railway networks were designed, and like modern ships with the great cargo ships were invented, and therefore the transport of goods was cheap and trustworthy. We started to consume products that came from far distant places in high quantities, okay? In the 16th century, yeah, we consumed products from China, but only very rich people, because they were extremely expensive to transport, and it was very risky. Nowadays, constantly we receive millions of tons of goods from Asia that are transported in a very safe and cheap way through across the oceans by these huge cargo ships. Yeah. And in a parallel way, the progress of communications explained that companies and individuals could be in close contact across the world. Yeah, so without basically the internet, but before the telephone, the telegraph, mail, and so on, it would have been extremely difficult for one person to have a company, or for one company to have offices in different countries and manage them and take decisions in short periods of time. In the last in the last decades, with the internet and the decreasing of prices of the telephone, this communication has become instant. So this has facilitated outsourcing. What is outsourcing? So it's when one company decides to move part of its activities to another country where it's cheaper to, where these activities could be done at a lower price. Yeah. So usually these multinational corporations decide to relocate some of their manufacturers or services in countries where labor is cheaper. There are less taxes, or legislation is more permissive. Yes, so clothing companies do this a lot. Okay, they outsource their production of clothes, but many companies do it. Even software companies realize that it is cheaper to to develop their products this way, or even phone assistance in many cases is outsourced to countries where it's cheaper. For example, in Spain, a lot of the phone service is done in Latin America because the population speaks the same language, but their salaries are way lower. Yes, so they could do the same. They could provide the same service or produce the same good at a way lower price. But then, in an international market, they could sell it at a high price, or at a certain price. Having a bigger profit. This is one thing that we are going to see very often in these units that we are going to talk about the economy, and that it's very important that you understand. Then we have, in general, the expansion of the capitalist system. Yes, so until not so long ago, less than 40 years ago, 30 years ago, sorry, the capitalist model, so the market that we will talk about it next week, so an economic model based on a market economy, on the law of supply and demand, was not the only model. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, it is the only, basically, all countries in the world have market economies. And the tendency is not only to have economies that are regulated by the law of supply and demand, but also the tendency is to expand the model of free trade. So free trade is trade without tariffs. Remember that tariffs are taxes to imports. So basically allow the free move of goods around the world, without taxing them. We will see the problems of that for certain countries. So free trade has advantages for some people and some countries and some companies, and have huge disadvantages for others. But it is evident that by having a world market, the exchange of goods, services, capital, ideas, and cultures has increased a lot in the last 30 years because there are no barriers for this. Altogether with this, the growth of the international organizations that try to promote these market economies, free trade, and so on, has explains the success of these models. Yeah, so we have the World Trade Organization that promotes these, economic agreements between countries, so they eliminate their tariffs and in general promote exchange. The G8, G20, the European Union, the Mercosur, there are many international organizations that whose goal is to promote economic relations between countries and basically based on free trade. And then we have the presence of the multinational companies. That is a growing tendency in the world because obviously, although in a market economy, there is competence, it's based on the competition between companies. The reality is that at the end, huge companies have it easier to to have a bigger share on a market and also to have a presence in another market. Yeah, so we can say that it's easier for Zara to expand to new markets, to countries where it was not present, than to a small company. And even like a local company would have it very difficult to compete with Zara because it's a huge company, that is able to produce at a mass level for millions of consumers around the world. Yeah. So the role of multinational companies in globalization is essential, and it's very important that we understand it. We will also analyze it across the upcoming units. So what are the consequences of globalization? So we can see some positive consequences and some negative ones. Yeah. So let's start seeing the positive. So obviously in a bigger market, in a global market, there are more opportunities for companies and individuals. That is true. Yes. So if you produce a very specific good or you provide a very specific service, by having access to the whole world, your possibilities of selling your service or product are big. Yes. So even in theory, at least, a small company could thrive. Okay, thrive is like when you do well in something, in a certain situation. So the exchange of goods and services is easier and more accessible than ever. Yes, so we can buy and sell to any other part of the world very easily. Yeah, we constantly buy things that are sent from other continents. Or if we want to open, an online shop of something, it's quite easy to have access to customers in other places. And even more if, for example, imagine that I teach online. Yes, so I could reach anybody in across the world, with like something that it would be unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago. Production is organized in a worldwide scale. What does this mean? That this provokes somehow a tendency on countries to specialize in the production of certain goods and providing certain services. Yeah. So each country ends up specializing in the things that they are more competitive on. Is this good? Yes and no. Okay, they find a market, but we are going to learn that specializing too much in the economy, it's a problem. So diversification, that is the opposite, means that you produce a lot of different things. So your economy is not dependent on a few sectors. It's essential for the good functioning of an economy. One example that you can understand. Yeah, Spain. The Spanish economy relies a lot on the tourism sector. Yeah, so an important part of the economy depends on that. Tourism and in general, hospitality, that is called in English, no? Restauración y hoteles y demás. What did occur? That with the pandemic, the global pandemic, tourism and in general going to restaurants and going to hotels dropped dramatically for obvious reasons. And suddenly an important sector of our economy is completely incapable to recover. Yeah? In other countries where obviously they have a tourist sector, but it's not so important, and maybe they have other, the economy is more divided in other European countries in different sectors. It was not it was hit, but not so dramatically as Spain is suffering it, because we relied a lot on just, in one sector that we don't even know when it's going to recover. Yeah. We were going to see many examples of this. And obviously, economies of scale are more profitable. Profitable que son más ventajosas económicamente, ¿no? Producen un beneficio económico mayor. What is an economy of scale? That the cost of producing something is reduced when you produce more. Yeah. So if I want to produce 10 pairs of shoes, the cost of making the design, buying the materials, and having the machinery and the employees, the workers that know how to use those machines in order to produce 10 shoes, is going to take 10 pairs of shoes, is going to make those shoes very expensive. But if instead of 10, I produce 1,000,000 shoes, the design will be the same, so the cost of design will be divided amongst those 1,000,000. The machinery will be the same, just being used for more time. Having workers that are prepared to do that will be the same. I mean, obviously more for a longer time, but buying materials will be way cheaper, because that when you buy more of a certain good, the price is reduced, if you make a bigger purchase. So this is called economy of a scale. Yeah? So when you produce at a big scale, the price drops. Yeah? So you could be more competitive. Yeah? So that is why Zara is one of the reasons, not it's why the main reason, but it's one of the reasons that, for example, Zara could make very cheap clothes, apart from, exploiting its workers, but it's also because they produce a lot of items. If you have a small clothing brand, you cannot compete with that. And then this, the use of this economies of scale, the outsourcing, buying raw materials in the cheapest places, using the cheap labor of poor countries, and selling their goods in most economically developed countries, increases the profit. But it is very important to understand that it's mainly multinationals who benefit from this. So most small companies and individuals do not benefit much from this. So only when you are a big company that have presence in many countries and you are able to buy and sell and produce and move your goods across the world, you are benefited by this. If you are a small company or you're just an individual, your capacity to benefit from this is way smaller. So now let's see the negative consequences. There are a lot. So poor countries are exploited. So in this international context, poor countries don't have the mechanisms to organize, their economies in a way in which they could decide what to do and at what price they could sell their products. Yeah, so they end up in a situation that they could not leave, in which they export raw materials at a very cheap price, or they allow the presence of multinational companies with factories that pay very little to their workers and barely pay any taxes at all. Yeah. So as a consequence of this, developed countries that used to produce manufacture goods and raw materials lose their jobs because they cannot compete with the prices of in the international market. Yeah. So 30 years ago, Zara produced its clothes in Spain, in small workshops and small factories in Spain. But when Zara realized that they could produce their clothes in Bangladesh or China at a way lower price, but like 10% of the cost. It was impossible. They started, to try to force the workers here in Spain to accept worse conditions. But obviously, they could not compete with the prices in Bangladesh because life in Spain is way more expensive than it's in Bangladesh. So they ended up closing all those workshops and small factories that existed in Spain. So this is a problem that is not just a problem of like poor conditions for less economically developed countries and emerging countries, but also for more economically developed countries where they cannot compete with the prices of those other countries, so they end up jobless, or at least without the jobs that they used to have. Yeah, that explains why factories, the secondary sector has been reducing in the developed world in the last decades. And they had only kept the manufacturers that have a higher added value, usually like things that require more technology, that are more associated with research and development, that are basically more profitable. But all the other things that require less knowledge and less technology have been outsourced to cheaper countries. So in this context, as I was saying, small companies find increasingly difficult to compete with these big multinationals or transnational corporations. As I was saying before, it's impossible for a small company to compete with the capacity that Zara has, to buy at very low prices with very beneficial conditions for them, the raw materials, and then transform them, paying very little, but they buy a lot. It is impossible to compete for that for a small company. Yeah? So governments from underdeveloped and developed countries are influenced in their political and economic decisions by these transnational companies and their lobbies. What is a lobby? A lobby is a group that just tries to promote changes in legislation and governmental decisions in favor of usually a group of companies, or one company or one economic sector. In Spain, lobbies are prohibited, but at the end they exist. But in Europe, for example, in the European Union, they are allowed, or in the United States. So a group of companies could decide to try to convince lawmakers, to convince the members of the parliament or government to pass laws that benefit them. And they are very powerful. Yeah. So some of the biggest multinationals in the world have a higher income than many countries. Like the country's GDP of many countries. So obviously they have the economic power to convince or force countries to pass legislation that favors them. So it could be legislation that creates more profitable markets for them, or legislation that is less strict with, the pollution of the product or whatever. Yeah, this is a huge problem nowadays for all governments in the world. This provokes the accumulation of wealth by very few people in the world. So 1% of the world population accumulates more wealth than the 99% of the population. Yeah? So the tendency with this is to have an economic polarization in which the rich are richer and the poor and poorer. If we saw it in a graph, we would see this, the tendency that exists in the world. Since the crisis of 2008, the tendency has moved very fast, So the poor have become poorer, their working conditions are worse, the money they earn is less, the cost of living is higher, whereas the rich are paying less taxes than ever and making a bigger profit than ever. So for the same reason, poor countries become poorer. It is impossible for them to break the vicious circle of poverty. They are trapped in a situation that they cannot escape by themselves, because their only way to obtain money is by selling their labor and their products to companies from the rich countries, and these companies impose conditions, and they don't have the capacity to negotiate. In many cases, they end up having huge debt that is impossible for them to pay, so they end up being extremely dependent from their creditors. And then, I'm sure you already know about this, there's a huge environmental problem. This economic model of like a consumer culture exploit natural resources from poor countries without much respect to the environment. So in many cases they use the natural resources of the less economically developed countries. They pollute their waters, their soil, their atmosphere, their air, and then these products are mainly sold in the most economically developed countries. So the impact is not even in the most economically developed countries. So when we buy a pair of shoes or a pair of jeans, all the pollution that they provoked in Bangladesh, we don't even see it because we are here. Yeah? We will see more about this in the next units. Yeah, there are many examples of this, like the destruction of ancient primary forest of the taiga in Russia to produce IKEA furniture, the destruction of the tropical rainforest in Indonesia in order to plant palm oil for the food industry, and many other things. We will see a lot of this in the upcoming units. So if we analyze the distribution of geoeconomic regions in the world, we can observe that the world is divided in economic regions that have strong relations. So the three main economic centers in the world, we call them the triad because there are three. One is North America, US and Canada, then the European Union, and then Japan. These countries have very strong economies and very advanced societies with high levels of consumption. Then we have the emerging countries that we find like most of South and Central America, China, India, South Korea, and like Southeast countries. We can say, okay, China is the biggest economy in the world, but at the same time, it could be considered an emerging country because it is still like the level of development of its population is very uneven, is very unbalanced. Yeah, so the level of development, the average level of development is lower than in the triad countries, and there is a very uneven situation between people in the cities and people in rural areas, and in general the working conditions of workers are, and their salaries are very low for their work they're doing. And then we have like the countries that are developed, but and that are predominant in a certain region, but that they are not so relevant at a world level. So for example, Russia is clearly a regional power, so it's the most important country amongst the country around us in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. South Africa is the most, it's the strongest economy and the most developed in all Central and South Africa, yeah, but its relevance does not go beyond, or Australia in Oceania. And then we have the underdeveloped countries, all the rest, in the African continent, Latin America, and Asia. I hope this helps you to understand more or less what globalization is. This is very important to understand many of the things that we will be talking about in the next 2 months or so. So please read it again or listen to the video again. And do the other activities that you have to do for this week.